Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending. Questions can be asked using the Q&A pane in the WebEx event control panel. Today's presentation will be recorded. If you have any objection, you may disconnect at this time. The recording will be available on demand within 48 hours of the live program. I will now turn it over to Henry. You may begin.
Thank you, Kelly. Good afternoon, SHRM, Long Island. It is 12:01. What's today's date? Friday, my phone. Friday, November 20th. Oh, it's on the screen. I should have looked at my own slides. Friday, November 20th. This is the week before Thanksgiving. I decided to have some fun with the slides, as I always try to do to keep everybody entertained on what I know is their favorite 20 minutes of the month. Notice I didn't say day, I went more broad, month. The weather is nice. I've had deer walking all over my lawn today, so this is one of the perks of working from home. I've had my internet cut in and out several times, so that's fun. So if at any point today you don't hear me, then Kelly will jump in and read the slides because it means I lost connectivity or something else went wrong. But hopefully that doesn't happen. So I went for the fun move today with a little bit of flashback to my younger days of Sesame Street. So today's letter is T. Two fun things and one not so fun thing. Thanksgiving, turkey, and travel. So in a time where I think some people are probably sick of paid sick leave, sick of COVID-19, sick of FFCRA and all the other fancy laws that we've had to deal with the last 8 or so months at this point. I'm thinking, what else can we talk about except the thing that's probably in the front and center of everybody's mind right now, employee travel, maybe even your own personal travel. You can use this for work reasons, you can use this for personal reasons. But the reason why this is important, I think it's pretty obvious. Next week is, I think, what we would say used to be the biggest travel time of the year. I think AAA would tell you that. But now we heard the CDC is advising against travel. We obviously see COVID-19 numbers spiking across the country. We see schools closing again. We hear scuttlebutt about restrictions on businesses that may be coming back. So it's unfortunately things that have been spoken about. We heard about this in the summer, that this could happen again. We kind of, I think, all hoped collectively that it wouldn't. But unfortunately, here we are. The numbers are continuing to spike. Right now, there's no news on the Western Front in New York. We had the city schools going remote the other day. Mayor de Blasio has hinted at Governor Cuomo possibly introducing, his cluster zones into other areas, expanding it and limiting businesses, limiting gyms, limiting indoor dining. We have nothing to report on that yet. Could it happen? Of course. Will it happen? I hope not, but I think we will all agree that safety is a high priority. So travel is going to matter a lot, especially as people start to consider leaving, for quote unquote vacation on Tuesday or Wednesday to head out to see family that they now haven't seen in maybe 8 or 9 months. I mean, we all know it. There's been missed weddings, there's been missed, unfortunately missed funerals, missed occasions all around because the world essentially shut down. But now you've got a lot of employees who I'm sure are bored. They are sick of this. They don't want to stay home anymore. Thanksgiving is obviously generally a family holiday. It's tradition, and people are just going to do what they want. So we need to be mindful of the fact that it is not unlawful to travel. There's no law that says you cannot travel to any destination. Common sense and the law are not always hand in hand. So some people may throw common sense to the wind and say, I'm going to travel anyway. You as the employer arguably cannot stop them from that travel because it's lawful. However, you may be able to impose some work-related restrictions regarding their travel that may disincentivize the travel or may have people second guess the duration of their travel. So why is this all important? Because New York got out in front of it. I know we all know back in June was when the original travel advisory came out, where we talked about restricted states in this frequently updated list. And all the states put on Governor Cuomo's naughty list as far as where you couldn't go without having to come back and face a quarantine. So CDC continues to evolve. The New York Department of Health continues to evolve. And we get more information on incubation periods, how long COVID-19 may stay in somebody's system, how long somebody may have to quarantine, testing and testing turnaround. So that's all been kind of combined to generate this new travel advisory. It came out, I want to say, on Halloween. It's Saturday the 31st, with an effective date of that following Wednesday, I believe it was November 4th, 12:01 in the overnight. The travel advisory changed. We lost those restricted states, and many of you may say, oh, I already know this, but this is we're going to get into a little bit of recommendations on kind of how you can handle employee travel as we go forward in the next 15 or so minutes. But what did it change? It essentially made every state that doesn't touch New York geographically, it made them restricted. Essentially, that's how it's now, you can interpret it that way. All non-contiguous states. So what does that mean? State that doesn't touch New York. What are the states that do touch New York? You have them there: Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Vermont, and Massachusetts. Those touch New York. Therefore, all the rules we're going to talk about today do not apply to those states. If people are flying or driving to those states, they, and many of them are drive worthy. But listen, technically, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is I think a good 7 or 8 hours from here, in the westernmost part of Pennsylvania, you very well may fly there. Despite that, this travel advisory would not apply based on Pennsylvania touching New York, being a contiguous state. So it applies to every other state. So that's obviously 44 other states. You take out New York and these 5. It applies to the 44 other states, and it applies to travel to any CDC level 2 or level 3 travel health notice countries. I've said those words a lot. Some people ask me, is this country there? Is that country there? So I figured the easiest thing to show you is which countries are not level 2 or level 3. So if you're really looking to plan your COVID-19 vacation, where can you go and then not have to come back and quarantine? This is it. This is the list. Every other country in the world is on either a level 2 or level 3, which means moderate risk, level 2, high risk, level 3, or if the country is unknown, if there's not enough data for the CDC to make a determination, they don't call it high risk, but they group them in level 3. And they say, we don't know enough, so we're going to just put this here. Don't travel there because for all we know, it's really bad. So these are the countries where you can go. I think I've been to, Bermuda? No, I think I was in the Bahamas. I don't think I've been to any of these places. So I've been to the Cayman Islands. I got that one. All right. So that's about it. Would love to maybe go to New Zealand, Thailand. There's places that I would love to, see. So if you are looking to check off some places off your bucket list, these are where you can go that it is quote unquote safe as far as the CDC's viewpoint. My viewpoint is don't travel anywhere, but that's me. But this is where you can go. If employees tell you they're going to any of these places, technically they can come back, no harm, no foul, no quarantine requirements. They would not be violating state law. Anywhere else you go, you are following the travel advisory as a traveler. So what are the criteria for quarantine? All travelers entering New York from a state that is not a contiguous state, so that's the other 44 states that we discussed, or from a CDC level 2 or level 3 travel health notice country, so that's every country outside of the ones on that prior slide, shall quarantine for a period of 14 days. That's the baseline. Baseline is everybody quarantines for 14 out of that 14-day quarantine. We call it, quote unquote, test out. So you can take a certain number of tests and possibly get out of the requirement to quarantine for 14 days. So how do you avoid the 14-day quarantine? What are those quote unquote exceptions? How do I test out? If you have traveled outside of New York for more than 24 hours, the traveler must obtain testing within 72 hours prior to arrival in New York. That's number one. Now, that means within 72 hours does not mean it has to be exactly 72 hours before you leave. Because what if you're going to a place that you're only going to be in for 48 hours, 60 hours, 70 hours, less than 72, but greater than 24? What do? you get a test before you come home in that location. So if you're going to Maryland, a non-contiguous state, if you're going to Florida, Texas, California, any of those places, if you're going to any of those states that are non-contiguous, then you should be getting, you are going to be there for more than 24 hours, which most travel is going to be more than 24 hours. The employee, or the traveler, I should say, the traveler must get a test in that state before coming back to New York. That has to happen. The second thing they must do, when they return, they must quarantine for a minimum of 3 days, measured from the time of arrival. So when they get back, 3 more days they must quarantine. And on day 4 in New York, now we're back in New York, on day 4, they can get another test to exit the quarantine. They need 2 negative tests if you have traveled for more than 24 hours to a non-contiguous state. You need one in the location that you travel to, and one one on day 4 when you come back in New York, on day 4 being back in New York. So you're going to have 2 tests. Now, the thinking here, for those of you that say, well, what if I was in a place for 26 hours, just over 24? I'm there for basically a day. I got to get a test there. The answer is yes. That's how this is written. If you are, and again, if you don't fit into an exception, which we're going to get into the essential worker exception in a second. But if you, if you spend the 72, if you spend more than 24 hours in that location, and you're only in that location for a day, you're only there for 26 hours, let's say, 25 hours even, go with 24 hours in a minute, whatever you want to call it. If you're there, get a test when you're there if you are the traveler. The goal, the reason why it's 72, why it says within 72 hours, the point was if you're there for longer, get it 3 days before you come back. Then on day 4 in New York, you get it. How much is that? That's a 7-day period of tests. That's the incubation period that the Department of Health is looking at, saying, okay, if you tested negative 72 hours before you left, that 3 days passes, you come home to New York, you spend 4 days in New York, now you're there for 4 days, now we're at a total of a week, and if you test negative again, that means for the entire duration of that incubation period of COVID-19, you beat the test. You test out, you're good, you can break your quarantine, you don't have to quarantine for 14 days. That's if you're there for more than 24 hours, provided you're not covered by one of the exceptions we're going to get into in a second. What if I go for less than 24 hours? The rules are much, much less strict. So if you are there for less, if you are in a different state, a non-contiguous state for less than 24 hours, you do not need a diagnostic test in that state. So if I drive to Maryland, hang out there for 16 hours, I do not need to get tested in Maryland. I could if I want to, but I do not need to get tested. I do not need to get tested when I am in Maryland. And I do not need to quarantine upon return to New York. However, I must still do 2 things. I must fill out the traveler health form that's on the Department of Health website. If anybody doesn't have that readily available, they want to provide that link to an employee. It's easily found online. If you need help or if you have questions, you can reach out to me. If you work with me, no problem. Plus, that person, this traveler who's been gone for less than 24 hours, must obtain a diagnostic test on the 4th day after arrival in New York. So that testing when you get back to New York still applies. Couple of other things. This applies to all individuals. I've gotten this question a few times. It is not just for people traveling from out of state for the holidays or something of that sort. It is for anybody. Anybody who lives in New York, doesn't live in New York, international traveler, anybody. These rules apply to everyone, again, unless you're going to fit into that essential worker exemption, which I'm going to get into in a second. Everyone, regardless of time spent traveling, must fill out the Department of Health traveler health form. That's the one I mentioned to you, is available online, very easy to find. And this is serious. This is not something that people can say, oh, they'll never find me, they'll never take me alive, that line of thinking. The Department of Health has the ability to enforce these quarantines. I put these numbers here not to scare people, but because it's the truth. And this applies to you traveling, or it applies to your employees traveling. If they break their quarantine, this is not the employer punishing them. This is the Department of Health punishing them. It could be up to 15 days in jail or a penalty, civil penalty of $10,000 if they break their quarantine order. So the whole testing out thing to get out of the quarantine is helpful if you don't want to spend 14 days sitting at home with your employer possibly telling you you can't work during that 14-day quarantine. This I just threw in here. We don't have to go through each one, but it's how to safely quarantine. Some of you may look at this as I did and say, it's not that bad. Food must be delivered to my quarters. Somebody has to pick up my garbage. No unauthorized access. So for all you introverts out there who just say, like, I I want room service and everybody to leave me alone, maybe go travel. That might be your way of getting there. Still have to have your temperature taken, and there's ways to safely quarantine. Unfortunately, if anybody's been under a quarantine order, you may already know this, but these are just some helpful pointers, which are also available online through the New York State Department of Health website. Now, the exception, the one to the travel advisory are permitted for essential workers traveling from a non-contiguous state or level 2 or 3 countries, so the quote-unquote bad places that you can't go. They are, and they are limited based on the duration of time. Oh, I left out a K. The duration of time in New York. I don't know where New York is, but that's probably a place you can't travel to either. What is an essential worker? Any individual employed by an entity included on the Empire State Development Essential Business List. That's a very broad definition. So we all know this essential business list. If you were an essential business during March and April, when this was one of the employer's most important questions to determine whether or not they could continue operating, if you were determined to be an essential business, whether you decided it based on the state's criteria or you got a designation from the state, that means all of your employees, any individual employed, all of your employees are technically essential workers. So what happens if you're an essential worker? What must you do? What must you do if you are an essential worker when you return? Because this is a rule that applies to everybody now. This applies if your travel has been less than 24 hours. This applies if your travel has been more than 24 hours. This applies if your travel is to, and there's a essential workers do, even though they're exempt from the quarantine requirements, they still must get tested on day 4 after they get back in New York. This is new. This was not in the old travel advisory. It was a recommendation. It was you should get tested. You should seek testing within 24 hours. That was the old guidance. The new guidance, it now says you must get tested as an essential worker returning from travel from a non-contiguous state, regardless of how long you spent in that non-contiguous state. One other piece, if anybody here deals with teachers, school employees, childcare workers, they must still quarantine even though they are essential workers. The whole point being that with students and teachers, being in this, the close contact in a classroom, the congregate settings, obviously the ability for this to spread more easily with people, with teachers that then have students, and the students can obviously go home to their families. It makes it an exponential growth concern. So even teachers, even though they are essential, school employees, even though they are essential, child care workers, even though they are essential, must quarantine for the 3 days. So they are not fully exempt from the travel advisory, even though they fit under the essential worker exemption. This is just a reminder, the New York State quarantine leave law, if somebody engages in voluntary travel, Thanksgiving related, holiday related, vacation related, they do not get the New York State emergency COVID-19 paid sick pay, paid sick leave. They do not get the quarantine pay. That's the same thing, but they don't get that 5 or 10 days of pay if they voluntarily travel. Couple of other considerations, and we'll actually end pretty close to on time today. FFCRA applicability. FFCRA is the federal law. We all know and maybe hate by now. It expires December 31st. But there's a big distinction as to whether or not your workers are essential workers or non-essential workers. If they're essential workers, then they are exempt outside of the teachers and the child care and school employees. They are exempt from the travel advisory. So there is no order for them to quarantine. With no order for them to quarantine, that means there is no order under FFCRA for them to then receive the emergency paid sick leave under the FFCRA. This is if you are less than 500 employees, and FFCRA applies to you. So that essential, non-essential designation is very important because it may determine whether or not the employee is FFCRA eligible based on their travel. It's a little bit of a wacky system because people can end up possibly traveling, getting a paid vacation through you, and then possibly being entitled to FFCRA leave. So it's something you really need to think about based on how you classify yourself as an employer. A travel policy, if any of you attended the breakfast series, I think I spoke about it a month or two ago when it was Craig, Tim, and me. You could have a travel policy. You cannot prohibit travel easily because it is not, as I said before, it's not unlawful to travel. You may determine whether or not to freeze the usage of PTO. There There's some ups and downs to that you should discuss with counsel if that's something you're thinking about. You may want to have a communication to all employees pre-Thanksgiving about being safe and precautions and what you want them to do or what you may make them do upon return from travel. That's something to think about as well. Obviously, time is of the essence there, even if you want to do it after Thanksgiving for possible holiday travel, year-end travel, things you want to think about. What expectations do we want to set for our employees? Are we going to let them all come back to work after they travel? Are we going to make people quarantine after they travel? Maybe we're going to make them quarantine above and beyond what the travel advisory requires. That's okay. You can set those policies, but you got to communicate them. If there's travel that's required for work, such that you're mandating it as the employer, that's a separate issue. There you're going to have employees that are going to be eligible for the quarantine pay under New York State. It's not going to be something where you can say, oh, we're going to make you travel, but we're also not going to let you get any of the benefits. And then lastly, the New York Lawful Activities Law. Simply, you cannot discriminate against an employee because they engage in lawful activity. So you want to be very careful not to punish people for engaging in lawful travel. Again, something that may be worth discussing with counsel on a case-by-case basis, depending on the situation. So with that said, my favorite cartoon, dog, good old Snoopy. I wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving. Watch a Charlie Brown Thanksgiving special if you can access it. Always a good pastime of mine. But I hope everybody has a very happy, safe, and healthy Thanksgiving. Be smart, be vigilant, be careful. Remember Governor Cuomo executive order, private in-person gatherings, 10 people or less. There is enforcement mechanisms as I went over. So just let's all be smart, work together, and hopefully we'll see brighter days ahead. I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend, a wonderful holiday. I will speak to everybody again in December, and take care and enjoy. Thank you.